Okay, so Phil Jones, Managing Director of Brother, thank you very much for taking part in this leadership series. I'd like to start today's conversation, Phil, by asking you about your career to date. How have you got to where you are? What have been some of the sort of key successes along the way?
Thanks for having me today, Paul. Well, I started actually quite by accident in the industry of sales. So when I left college, I went and tried my hand in the pub trade. And after a few years of doing that, and also probably living like an episode of EastEnders, I think it was the day that the pub was set on fire, that the following morning I just said, it's time to leave this industry. So I literally walked down the Tottenham Court Road in London, walked into a recruiter and just said, what can I do? And they said, well, as it happens, we've got this job and it's a sales trainee. So I just said, well, I've got nothing to lose, and off I went. So that started me in a career of sales fundamentally. And then after 2 or 3 moves, as I got to know my craft, I joined Brother in 1994. And I joined as a salesman covering the sales territory for the south of England. And over the years, I've just managed to move up the ladder, really. So I came as a salesperson, then a sales manager, then I became sales director, then I became sales and marketing director, then I joined the board, then I became deputy managing director in 2012, and ultimately appointed as its managing director in 2013. So a career at Brother so far has been roughly 24 years. And during that time, I'm probably one of those rare cases of somebody that really joined at the bottom and worked themselves all the way up to the top.
And what have been the sort of key leadership lessons you've learned along the way then?
Oh gosh, many. I think probably my greatest period of learning was when I decided that when I was first made sales director, probably in the early 2000s, that I wanted to try and find a way to really increase team performance. And I realized there that my skill set really probably wasn't that great. I was almost over promoted into that role, if I'm being perfectly honest, Paul. And I employed a sports psychologist who happened to be the husband of somebody who was doing some work for us on QVC. And he was a sports psychologist who had a model that he wanted to use in business. So he said, after a conversation, he said, look, I can definitely improve your team. And I went, brilliant, consider yourself retained. And he said, but there's only one small caveat. And I said, well, what's that? And he said, well, me and you are going to have to do about 3 months worth of work together first. And effectively, for me to make them better, I must make you better. And effectively, that started a 3-month or so journey with a psychologist called Stephen Sylvester, where I think I went through probably one of the greatest periods of growth in my life, because I pretty much got stripped back to the bone in terms of understanding everything about who I was, how I operate, how I think, what was really determining my outcomes, and then beginning to rebuild. So I think the greatest lesson for me there was actually, to be an effective leader, you have to face some of the most difficult questions about who you are and resolve them, and then be happy with what the result ends up as. So you've got to be then completely congruent with who you are and what you stand for. And then you can really move forward with, I think, both your personal and professional lives.
So how did that allow you to evaluate yourself then? How would you say you've critically reflected on your leadership style and experience and sort of built that career over the years?
Well, I think the first thing for me to say is that I probably would not have been so self-reflective if I didn't have a psychologist sitting at my side. So you really have got somebody there asking, not only probing questions of you, but then providing you with pathways and a safe environment to ultimately explore what those answers might be. And sometimes those answers of why you do what you do are quite difficult, because they are formed from past events and all various other things. So it's a really, really tricky period. So I think my major learning from that was that Self-development, you can do self-development, of course you can. I've read numerous books over my years, and I'm still an avid reader today, and I get a lot of, I acquire a lot of knowledge from that. But actually the big lesson there was that you have to find a way for a feedback loop to exist about how you are performing. And I remember one of the initial exercises that I had with Stephen was I actually had to go back to the business at the time and calibrate who I thought I was and how I thought I performed with what people's personal experience was of how I performed. And that really was one of the toughest weeks in my life, because actually what I realized was I thought I was great, and the reality is they probably didn't. And then when you get to the nitty gritty of, well, why do you not, why is there a difference here? The reality probably came down to that I was very achievement orientated. It was all about the goal and achieving things, and really people were becoming just resources for me to achieve that. And I wasn't seeing the human behind the person or the job or the function. So once I kind of got that feedback, which was very bruising, when you get to hear that what you think you are is not what people are experiencing, that really allowed us to put the corrective actions in place, and for me to begin to, I guess, have a new behavior around people, which was probably closer to the real me anyhow. But ultimately we needed to get that real me congruency set in order that I could really move forward.
And do you think some of that comes from your background of having started your career in sales, which is always very sort of goal focused, and therefore you're always looking to achieve the next goal, and that maybe drives some of the behaviors then in how you are as a leader and a manager?
Oh, without a doubt. When you're constantly pressed by monthly targets, quarters, financial years, and then of course you're at that stage of your life, perhaps in your mid-20s or late 20s, where you're striving to achieve things. You're looking to buy a better car, get a bigger house, all of these sorts of things. Then naturally achievement orientation becomes a byproduct of being in that particular profession. But I think that nowadays, perhaps being a bit more of a wise owl and looking back, I'm now able to use that experience with my own salespeople to give them a wider education about real effectiveness, what true effectiveness can be when you bring people with you on your journey. So actually getting, hitting your number can actually become easier, believe it or not. But I didn't quite realize that then. It took some maturity and some self-reflection to realize I could actually be a better version of me and achieve better numbers. And it became a catalyst actually for my ability then to go up the organization. Believe it or not, my behavior was stopping me getting on. And I think that's the real reflection.
I think it's a really interesting point and a fascinating one, because I had a similar situation myself where, earlier in my career, and I'd always been very, very goal focused. And probably similar to yourself, I'd done some feedback sessions with a psychologist. And one of the things they had identified is I was very goal orientated, and I was going to achieve what was set out to achieve. However, I wasn't necessarily thinking about how that affects other people and how that takes the team with you. It's just, we're going to achieve this goal, and we're going to achieve this goal at all costs, rather than how do we achieve this together and take everybody on that journey and get them to buy into it and enjoy doing it themselves.
Oh yes, I can strongly identify with that, Paul.
So how, sort of leading on from that, how do you know when your leadership style is becoming less effective, and how do you go about remedying that?
Oh, that's a really tricky question, isn't it? Because I think as long as you're always self-developing, that's probably quite good. If you're always developing self-awareness, so for example, I have my own values that I run, my own principles that I run as a person, which gives you a strong ability to self-audit yourself all the time. Am I behaving in the way and against the standards that I set for myself? So there's very much an intrinsic audit that I can do about what my expectations are for myself in leadership. But then again, you do have to have trusted people around you that can also tell you when things are sliding. And we're all human. And even in these leadership roles where we're meant to be invincible and superhero-like, you know, we also have not just what's going on at work, but what's going on at home and what's going on in our heads as a result of that. You're carrying multiple rucksacks with, you know, or stress buckets at any one time. And clearly those can merge at times. And there's times when your performance can, you know, not be at 100% because you're feeling the stress of something that might be going on outside of work. I think the key for me I've found is that having honesty, total honesty with the people closest to you. So with my senior leadership team, I have a really effective team of 3 that really, you know, run the business for me day to day in these sort of specific areas of operations that they're responsible for. And I can be really transparent with them. You know, I'm honest about when I've got challenges going on in my personal life, for example, or if I'm just feeling a lot of pressure because simply the build-up of the volume of work that you're going through, or because of a certain deadline, you know, year-end, budget year-end, doing the statutory accounts, preparing financial kickoffs. You know, every CEO will identify with that and say that March and April, you know, our fiscal year end is in March, New Year in April, is probably my peak busy time in the year. I have so much technical work to do that I know it's a laboured time for me. So I'll make sure I tell people that, and so that they've got an expectation in advance that actually that now is probably not the right time to ask for this or for that, but for them to also acknowledge that my workload is really heavy. And so I think once you've got that transparency and dialogue with people, then actually you naturally get told what you need to get told.
How do you go about managing yourself through that period and managing that stress relief? How do you disconnect from work and create that work-life balance?
Again, that's something you have to own. That's the one thing I realized, that I think coming into a top job, you never realize the pressure and responsibility of the top job until you're in it. When I was a number 2, life was a lot easier because I always had the number 1 to defer to. That there was always somebody there that was above you, if you see what I mean. But when you're that person, then you have to practice quite a lot of self-care, in my opinion. And part of that includes, I have a small mnemonic that I use, for example, an acronym called my DESK policy, DESK. And that means diet, exercise, sleep, and kindness. So particularly when you're under a lot of stress, then, you know, make sure you're eating well, you're exercising, you have enough sleep so that your brain can process everything, and you're kind to yourself. You know, give yourself a break, that you can't be perfect all the time. So my little DESK policy always runs in the background, but that forms part of just general situational awareness of self. So situational awareness is about having that constant awareness of everything that's influencing you in any moment, whether that be a work pressure or a personal pressure, or just how you feel, or your mental state, whatever it might be. You've got to know what's going on with your personal dials. And if your personal dials are all in the red, then you've got to do something and take responsibility for yourself. And I think this is sometimes something that's not easy for people to do, because what they do is they will slavishly pursue being in the red zone and ultimately burn themselves out. And you know, in my life, I have a coach. When I exercise, I employ a coach because I want, if I have limited time to exercise, I want to do what I can to the best of my ability. And if you ever go through training or you have a coach, one thing they'll talk about is, look, you know, your volume of work is really, or intensity of exercise is really dictated by frequency, intensity, and duration. But the most important side of getting fitter, faster, stronger is all of that plus rest and recovery. And if we as leaders don't take the rest and recovery bit, then ultimately you never reach your true potential. You never benefit from the frequency, the intensity, duration of that exercise. So if we take that as a metaphor for a business, then when we're under a lot of load, then give yourself a break sometimes and allow yourself to decompress and defragment from what's going on.
I think that is one of the hardest things, isn't it? Knowing when to rest and actually defragment and take a step away. I know personally it's one of the issues I've always struggled with, because being the person I am, you just throw yourself into it. You know, we've got a problem to solve and you do it. And you, as you sort of alluded to, you're working in that red zone. And actually sometimes you've got to realize and be self-aware enough to say, right, I am in the red zone and I do need to take a step away. But equally, this work still needs to get done, and to put a plan in place to manage that effectively.
Yeah, I mean, I've always been a big fan of the Jim Collins statement, which was go slow when you can and go fast when you must. And I think that really dictates the rhythm. So, you know, if I can look at any financial year and understand the rhythm of the financial year end, quarter end, that's your rhythm. But of course, then different pressures come within that, whether professional or personal. And you've got to be in this moment that certainly professionally, if we think of where we are right now, you know, mid-pandemic of the coronavirus, then we're all working very long hours with complex problems to solve all the time. And it's very dynamic and we're having to do an awful lot. But within that, we must make really good decisions. There's a responsibility on you as the leader to make really good decisions. And when you're in the red zone, generally speaking, it's more difficult to make good decisions because you're under pressure, you're under stress. But of course, there will be times when you've got to do that. And that's just putting yourself in the right possible area to make that decision. But when you're not pressured by that same time, give yourself the space to think things through. And exercise is one of the best ways to do that, whether it be a dog walk, whether it be getting on a bike, whether it be a swim, because it triggers your brain to sort of think more expansively, and it triggers all the chemicals in your brain to start giving you a little bit more capacity for your thinking. So this is why this desk policy that I spoke about a moment ago is so crucial, particularly when under load.
No, absolutely. And you sort of alluded to the sort of coronavirus pandemic, which we're all dealing with at the moment. How have you managed that process yourself, working either remotely or having to change the environment that people work within? How have you gone about managing that with that brother?
Yes, well, like all businesses, we sort of had a state of emergency. The sirens were wailing, weren't they, when we were mustered to get everyone working from home, really, within a space of a couple of days, which the team were just sensational in making that happen. They were just brilliant. And so we had never been in that situation before, having the entire company not in the building. And so it did require a lot of very dynamic decision making and a lot of goodwill from people, actually. But we thankfully had, good IT infrastructure. We had already deployed Microsoft Teams. We'd already got SharePoint. So the ability to run our organization remotely was actually there, but we'd never done a test of that, believe it or not. So thankfully we came through that, and we did particularly well. I think it does bring a lot of challenges. There's no doubt about that. Leading teams remotely is so difficult because culture is really important to us at Brother UK. And actually, if you look at the ingredients that you normally have around culture, around people, around values, all that kind of good stuff, we call them your ingredients. And let's say that culture becomes the cake that you bake as a result of your ingredients. You could argue that even now, all the ingredients are still there, but the cake doesn't taste the same, Paul. It doesn't. There's a different taste. And I think the ultimate thing there is that, why does it taste different? Well, because we are not having the same level of togetherness that we had, the social gatherings that we had, the human interaction, the sparked conversations, the banter. working remotely can be very transactional, and I'm sure people can identify with that. Meetings are 30-minute bursts. They start and finish. The small talk is transactional small talk. How are you? I'm fine. How are you? I'm fine. You can't truly see somebody and have deeper conversations of when you say, how are you? No, how are you? I really want to know how you are, because you don't look right today. People can hide behind cameras. People can make themselves look nice. And so a lot of the clues that I might normally use as a leader to know that someone's not themselves when I'm wandering around the business, just a look, a glance that you go, oh, someone's not right. I'm just going to check back on that person later in the day and just see if they're okay. Becomes much more difficult here because my time's being consumed by back-to-back meetings all the time, and we're working through tricky, complex problems. And I probably don't have the same amount of walking the floor time that I had when my organization's normally together. So I think my big issue really is, of course, you can run the business and manage the business. Leading the business and keeping the culture strong, I think, is more difficult.
And I would completely concur with that. A lot of my work is global, and for the last 10 years, we've done a lot of work via video conference. So for us, coronavirus wasn't really a shock to the system in terms of how we work, but actually it's those little day-to-day interactions. So, I would typically spend 1 week in another country in one of our other offices, learning about the culture of that office, working with the consultants, swapping ideas. And although you can do that via video, it's not quite the same. You're not building those relationships in the same way. And as you sort of said there, you can't quite see what the other person is really thinking, what their body language is like, because it's very different on camera to what it is face to face. And I think that's one of the really interesting points that's come out of this.
Yes, there's no doubt. When you're doing sort of leading by wandering about your organization, you can see when somebody's free, for example. They'll give you a quick bit of eye contact, and you sort of go, oh, how are you? What's new with you? What are you working on? Tell me something great that's happened this week. Whereas actually with, working remotely, we use Microsoft Teams, that actually you've got to check their schedule, that they don't have something scheduled in. Then you've got to schedule that drop in. You can't just sort of drop in because people are already on a call. So that's what I mean, I guess, by that. It's slightly more structured rather than flowing. And I think sometimes culture is really about the flow of your culture rather than its construct. We can have values on a wall, we can have objectives, we can have all of these things. But actually, culture really is the sum part of the individual actions and decisions and how people feel every day. And really, I think as a leader, part of your job is to continually nurture that. But there's no doubt it's more difficult for me to nurture that remotely than it is by wandering around. And I can, in my building, I might have been able to have 25 very quick conversations during a day, see people at lunch, hi, how are you? And what's new with you? How are the kids? And noted that there was a birthday and it's so lovely. But actually now that takes me time to schedule all of those things, and they've got to be scheduled in my available time and their available time.
Yeah.
Yeah, it just feels a bit more forced than perhaps I might normally, how I might normally work.
What would you say is the biggest leadership crisis you've faced in your career then?
Oh gosh, that's a really, really tough question. I think there's probably there was a situation which was probably more of a media crisis which then led to needing good leadership, if that makes sense. So the background to it was we were making a television ad, and that ad, which was very funny, it was scripted to be very funny, was how somebody that ran the sort of systems in a circus, lights, sound, gates opening and closing for the tigers, all this sort of stuff. The operating desk that they were on wasn't labelled. They nipped off to go to the loo and left the apprentice sort of in charge of the desk. So of course you can imagine moments later, chaos ensues, tigers are jumping out of cages and all this sort of stuff. So this was being filmed actually at a circus in France, traveling circus, and we'd done all of the due diligence about this in terms of animal welfare. We had vets on site, everything was done, signed off, everything was, we were in a place where we felt we'd done every single piece of due diligence that could be done, because fundamentally it involved live animals. The live animals were part of the TV ad, so the tiger jumping out the cage was that. But what we didn't realize was despite all of everything that we thought we had done to do the right thing, that there was actually a very, very big movement around animal welfare, which I now understand much better than probably I did when we had that TV advert film. And literally from the day that it went live on television, a global movement of activists found I was the one email. The campaign went out across Europe on the same day. I happened to be the name that got found on the internet and my email address, and so a global movement of activists then began to bombard my email inbox, and at peak I was getting 800 emails an hour.
Oh wow!
To understand what that was in terms of the volume of it all. And we effectively sort of got plunged into a crisis because there was this unintended consequence, I guess. And I think that was really probably where it needed some leadership. And I have another acronym that I use, 4-letter acronym. I've probably got a strong bias for acronyms, Paul, so I must confess that. And that's one that I developed actually after that crisis, which was calm. So keep calm in a crisis. And what that means is communication, action orientation, level-headedness, and being mindful, M. And so it struck me that really needed addressing. And so the particular pressure group that was driving the activity, I immediately reached out to their CEO. And obviously I'm based in Manchester, and I was actually in London the following morning. I got on the train and I went and met the chief executive the following morning. And I wanted to just show effectively what we felt was our due diligence. And actually we'd gone into this not understanding potentially what the impact of our actions were. And I was then explained kind of some of the deeper issues around animal welfare in circuses and all these sorts of things. And actually we agreed to pull the advert, and we listened. So there, if you think about that CALM acronym, it was about quickly communicating, having action, what can I do right now, staying level-headed, and being mindful. So I was mindful of their position, that they're passionate about a certain issue, but level-headedness meant I needed to go and understand the issue. So getting in that room very quickly, I think, was the really big lesson learned out of that. So we can all be in these highly pressurized environments where we've been in crisis, but actually it's very, very important when you lead to stay calm.
What would you say is an overrated leadership quality? Because I think, having done this for nearly 20 years now, you see the media build up individuals and you get a cult of a certain leader. And it always makes me sort of nervy, and sometimes our clients will say, we want you to find us a name for this role.
Right.
And I'm always like, what does that actually mean? And that's one of the things I would say. So what do they actually want there? Because if it's just the name, is that grossly overrated? So that is one of the things I'd like to know from your side. What do you think is kind of overrated from a leadership perspective?
Well, if we look around the world at the moment, I think probably we might say that probably charisma is overrated, Paul. Because charisma is fine. It's great to have charisma, but I think if you have charisma plus ego or charisma plus hubris, it becomes quite dangerous. And so for me, that's something that I like charismatic people. They're obviously magnetic. We're always drawn towards them. but I'm actually always much more involved in the personality and the deeper level of values that sit behind that charisma. Because if you can find somebody that has charisma, plus they're very values driven, very self-aware, so they can communicate very, very well and in a charismatic way, then that's brilliant. But I wouldn't over promote somebody on charisma alone. You know, for me, the most important things that we have within our organization is, of course, you know, for me, a big word in my life is mastery. And I did a talk to some younger people in the financial services sector in Manchester when we could, last year, you know, when we could go out and actually meet people. Remember that?
I'm not sure I can.
We'd have some drinks and you'd meet people face to face that you've never met before in a non-distanced way. And they asked really, what really are the big lessons that we should learn to be successful in our career? And I said, well, look, there's just one word I want you to focus on. It's mastery. And it's mastery of subject matter and mastery of self. So master your subject matter, which is probably the IQ side, become technically proficient, become really good at what you do, become an expert at that. But always make sure that you have mastery of self-awareness too, so that, you know, we talked about situational awareness, what your values and principles are in your life, what you stand for and who you are. And it's important that you work on both of those. Then if you have charisma on top of that, then it's probably a good accelerator to have in a leadership role. But if you don't have natural charisma, then don't worry, because who you are, your technical mastery, and your ability to then have situational awareness about yourself and to deliver that, to make sure that messaging comes out in the right way to the right audience, is probably equally as good. Charisma just helps it. So I think when people are over promoted into roles on charisma on their own, what it tends to do is the gaps in their general then decision-making, communication style and other practices soon become apparent.
I think this is an issue we pick up on quite a lot in our business when we're matchmaking for executives and organizations. And we often get situations whereby we have to remind chairmen or nominations committees or CEOs that actually they need to think a little bit outside of the box, because ultimately the old adage of people like them comes to the fore. And quite often you then get nominations committees, chairmen, chief execs hiring people who they like because they're similar to them. But that then limits diversity, and it limits not just diversity of gender, but there's all the whole gamut of diversity. And how can you inspire that from the top if you're closed to the type of person you're going to recruit and bring on board?
Yeah, it's no doubt, Paul. I mean, everyone's mature enough to understand now that the way you construct people in senior positions, the skills that they have, personality types, all the, like I said, the entire gamut of diversity needs to be accommodated. So, smart businesses become really the outputs of the smart people that you put in to help your business become smart. So the collective intelligence, if you like. But I think the most important thing here is that intelligence doesn't always get you your outcomes. It really doesn't. And that's one of the real big lesson I've learned over the years, is that I've seen so many smart businesses fail simply because they've got a great idea, but it's poorly executed because they haven't considered the human factor in execution. And about a year ago, I was doing a keynote somewhere and I came up with this line, which was, as a result, I guess, of my own experience, that we're an Investors in People Platinum Employer. We were Investors in People Platinum Employer of the Year, Paul. So the sort of the most platinum of all the platinums, if you like. So you could arguably say we're pretty good at what we do. But one thing I know is we're not perfect. We're not. And it made me think about this line, descriptive line, which said, all companies are dysfunctional. Successful companies simply manage their dysfunction more successfully. And what I mean by that is actually we're not perfect, but we're really good at managing perfection. So we do most of the right stuff more regularly. And that is taking a strong strategy, understanding what needs to be done to execute it, and then making sure that the motivation is there from your people, surrounded by the culture, in order to deliver it. When you get that right, you really increase your propensity to be successful, in my opinion. And I think where many fail is they miss the human factor. What is it that's going to motivate people to come on this journey with us, that's going to unlock their own personal potential, unlock their purpose, and give us discretionary effort? And when we can get that discretionary effort deployed against the things we need executed, which will deliver our strategy, then things become really brilliant. Then you surround your culture to create the right environment for all of those things to occur.
Well, Phil, thank you very much for that. Is there anything else you would like people to know, or anything you would like to communicate before we finish up today?
Well, I had one thought, which was really about, well, what does leading in the future look like? And it is also, I've been having a thought about something that I've described as being correlative leadership. And I came up with that word correlative leadership because there aren't many fancy words left to describe leadership anymore, Paul, and everyone else had written books and there was no words left. So I just chose that one. There was rationale behind it, I'm pleased to say, which is actually the correlation between certain skill sets. And my view is that for anybody watching this, that the skills that you must now build to be relevant as a leader are digital skills. So the C-suite needs to be more D, don't they? They've got to be sitting at that boardroom table, understanding the entire digital environment, about how businesses demand it and the expectations now for digital. That has to be skill at board level, not one level below board. So build your digital capability. Obviously, we've then got emotional. You build your IQ. Look, that's pretty standard stuff, right? Build that, work on your self-awareness, work on your mastery. So we've got digital, we've got emotional. Another area is actually to also then look at your the spiritual side of yourself, and that really is very challenging for people to understand that as a concept. And what I mean by that is that I've learned over the years that sort of having a greater connectedness to who we all are, and maybe dealing with somebody in life crisis. And I've dealt with many people in my leadership position at Brother UK, where sometimes some of your best performing people can just have a life crisis. Divorce, turning 50, turning 40, anything can cause a life crisis. And sometimes it means they begin to ask very big questions about themselves and life. And you need to be able to engage in that conversation with them, which means you've got to be equipped to sort of be able to go quite deep on some of those conversations, in my experience. And through coronavirus, we have seen we've had a very systemic impact to the way that our lives work, the way that organizations are run, working from home, all this kind of good stuff. But it's also been existential, in that it has made us as human beings almost begin to question everything about who we are, what we want from our lives, all of these different things. And I think an emotionally aware leader should be able to delve into these quite tricky topics. So if somebody turns up at your office and says, I'm a bit lost and I don't know who I am anymore, do you have the skills to take somebody who you rate really, really highly in your company through a journey that allows them to get back on track? And that's something that I think over the last, maybe since I've been getting a bit older, Paul, and perhaps you're developing more wisdom and just becoming a little bit, more life experienced, it strikes me that my ability to have those conversations with people has been a differentiator in the performance of our overall culture and the performance of our business.
Definitely say they're the hardest conversations to have. because you want to help and support without going too far and providing advice where it's not necessarily wanted, but you want to help them and support them along that journey.
Without a doubt. It's a sensitive pathway that you have to walk. But in my experience, if you have the emotional connectedness, if you act in a human manner, and you always come from a good place, a place of compassion, then ultimately people will see that, and I, in my experience, tend to engage in it. There are some that don't, because of course their own levels of self-awareness might not be such that they even want to explore that, or explore a discussion, a wider discussion about that. But I found it an important skill in my own toolkit over the last few years.
Bill, thank you very much for your time today. That's been really useful.
A pleasure.